Georgia is known for its beaches, for its Civil War battlefields, and for that southern warmth that those born there carry with them wherever they go. It is a state of verandas and magnolia trees and slow rivers that reflect the afternoon sky. But beneath all of that, there is another Georgia. Hidden deep in its thick forests, submerged beneath the calm surface of its lakes, there are places where entire towns once stood. Houses, churches, schools, shops, streets where children ran, markets where neighbors met and talked and lived their lives, places that today are silent or underwater or covered in moss and roots growing over what once was. In this video, we are going to discover 13 of those places. Towns that died in the fire of war by the decisions of engineers who dammed the rivers. It's by the passage of a railroad that chose another route, by racial violence that drove entire families from the land they had built with their own hands, or simply by the slow and irreversible abandonment that comes when the young leave and do not return. Each one has its own story. Each one has its own kind of silence. Let's begin. Number 13. Wrightsboro. Wrightsboro in McDuffie County was in its time the southernmost Quaker settlement in all of America. That fact alone makes it an unusual place. The Quakers were not the most numerous or the most powerful group in 18th century Georgia, but they were people of deep convictions and with the willingness to walk very far to be able to live according to them. The town was founded in 1768 by families who came from North Carolina looking for open land and religious freedom on the Georgia frontier. The Quakers believed in peace, in the simple life, in equality among people, and in a direct relationship with God, without intermediaries. Those principles guided the way they built Wrightsboro, a town of farms, dirt roads, and a community where neighbors supported one another because their faith demanded it. In its early years, the town grew with the orderly slowness of everything the Quakers did. Families built houses, cleared fields, planted corn and wheat. Wrightsboro became a small commercial center that connected the scattered settlements of the region. During the American Revolution, many of its residents supported the cause of independence. The town survived the 18th century and entered the 19th with the quiet solidity of a place that believes in its own permanence. It was the Civil War that began to undo it. The conflict devastated the economy of the South, and the effects were felt even in places as small and as far from the great battlefields as Wrightsboro. Farms struggled, commerce contracted, and young people, as always happens after wars, found reasons to leave for cities and railroad towns where there was more work and more future. By the early 20th century, only a few families remained. Buildings deteriorated without money or hands to repair them. By the 1920s, Wrightsboro had ceased to be an active town. What remains today is a historic church and a small cemetery where the first settlers rest beneath tall trees. The headstones are simple, as without ornamentation. It is the kind of place that reminds you that behind every date carved in stone, there was a complete life that the world no longer remembers. Number 12. Burton existed in the mountains of northern Georgia, in Rebun County, in one of those Appalachian valleys where life was never easy but was authentic. It was a settlement of farming families who knew their neighbors by name and knew what lay behind every hill. The post office opened in 1870, indicating that by that time, the town already had enough human mass to justify a formal connection with the rest of the state. The Tugelo River ran near Burton, and that river determined its fate. In the early 20th century, as electricity was beginning to transform American life, energy companies were looking for rivers that could be dammed to generate hydroelectric power. The Tugelo was perfect for that purpose. The right flow, the right terrain, the geography that made dam construction possible. In 1919, the Georgia Railway and Power Company completed the dam that created Lake Burton. The families that had lived in the valley for generations were forced to leave. There was no negotiation possible. Progress had decided that valley would become a lake, and the houses and farms and dirt roads that Burton's residents had built with their own hands would have to disappear under the water. Some moved to nearby towns. Others left the region entirely. Everything they could not take with them was left behind as the water began to rise. By the end of 1919, Burton had disappeared beneath the surface. Today, Lake Burton is one of the most beautiful in the Georgia mountains. Its shores are lined with cabins and docks, and visitors come in summer to sail and fish without thinking too much about what lies below. On the clearest days, when the water is calm and the light hits at the right angle, it is said you can still make out the foundations of old houses in the depths. The story of Burton is the story of countless communities that were sacrificed in the name of electrical progress, without anyone who made that decision ever having to see the faces of those who lost their homes. Number 11. Oscarville. Oscarville in Forsyth County has a history that goes beyond simple abandonment. It is a story of violence, of injustice, and of a crime that the state of Georgia took decades to fully acknowledge. In the early 20th century, Oscarville was a farming community where many black families owned their land. They had built their homes, planted their fields, raised their churches. It was the kind of community built over generations, with the accumulated work of parents who left something better to their children than what they themselves had received. In 1912, that world was destroyed in a matter of weeks. After a white woman named May Crow was assaulted, false accusations were made against black men from the area. The tension turned to violence with a speed that revealed the hatred had been waiting for only an excuse. White mobs attacked black residents, burned houses, and sowed a terror so systematic and so deliberate that by the end of 1912, virtually the entire black population of Forsyth County had been driven out. Families fled with what they could carry. The land they had legally owned was seized or abandoned without compensation. Oscarville was emptied. For decades, Forsyth County had the reputation of being a place where black people did not live. And that reputation was not accidental. It was the direct result of what had happened in 1912. In the 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers built a dam on the Chattahoochee River. The lake that formed, Lake Lanier, covered what remained of Oscarville under the water. Today, Lake Lanier is one of the most visited in Georgia, a recreation destination for millions of people each year. Divers who go into its depths have found submerged roads, building foundations, and cemeteries covered by the water. Beneath one of the most frequented lakes in the state lie the remains of a community that was destroyed by violence and then erased by water. Is number 10, Griswoldville. Griswoldville in Jones County was in the first half of the 19th century an industrial center of some importance in Georgia. Its factories produced weapons, ammunition, and textiles for the Confederacy during the Civil War. It was a town built around industrial work, where workers' families lived near the factories and where the rhythm of the machines set the pace of daily life. In November 1864, the troops of General William Tecumseh Sherman arrived at Griswoldville during his famous March to the Sea, the campaign that set out to destroy the South's industrial and logistical capacity to continue the war. The Griswoldville factories were exactly the kind of target Sherman was looking for, facilities that fed the Confederate war machine. The factories were destroyed. The houses were burned. The buildings were torn down. The town was razed in a single sweep with the brutal efficiency that characterized that campaign. Families fled without time to save almost anything. Griswoldville, which had taken decades to build, was destroyed in days. After the war, nobody rebuilt Griswoldville. The factories that had given it a reason to exist were gone, and without that economic base, there was no way to start over. The land was left empty. Nature slowly reclaimed the space, and today what remains is barely some earthen embankments, scattered foundations, and the nearly invisible traces of what was once a community. Griswoldville is one of the most direct reminders in Georgia that war does not only destroy armies, it also destroys the places where people lived. Number 9. High Falls in Monroe County grew on the banks of the Towaliga River. which in the second half of the 19th century was the energy source that made all the town's activity possible. It was an industrial town in the most concrete sense. The river turned the wheels turned the machines, and the machines produced the work that employed its residents. By the 1870s, it had a cotton gin, a shoe factory, and several other businesses that had been built around that water power. Farmers from the region brought their harvests to High Falls. Workers came to operate the mills. The streets had activity, the river had its constant rhythm, and the town believed in its own future with the confidence of someone who has found their place in the world. But in the 1880s, the railroad came to Georgia, or more precisely, the railroad came to the towns around High Falls, but not to High Falls itself. That omission was fatal. Without a rail connection, the factories could not efficiently ship their products or receive the raw materials they needed to operate. Businesses began losing money, jobs disappeared. Families moved to the railroad-connected towns where there was more work. By the early 20th century, High Falls was largely abandoned. The mills closed, the buildings deteriorated, and nature began reclaiming what the town had built alongside the river. Today, the site is part of High Falls State Park. People come to see the waterfalls, to walk the trails, to enjoy nature. Many do not know they are walking over the foundations of a town that disappeared because a train chose to go somewhere else. High Falls is the clearest case on this list of something history repeats without us ever quite learning, that the fate of a town is sometimes decided by someone who never lived in it. Number 8. Banning Mills. Banning Mills in Carroll County was built deep in the Snake Creek Gorge, a place so steep and so dense that today it is hard to imagine how anyone decided to establish an industrial community there. But the creek running through the gorge had exactly the force needed to power machinery, and in the 19th century, that was reason enough to build wherever building was necessary. At its best, Banning Mills had 10 operating mills producing cotton, paper, and other goods. The mills employed entire families who lived in houses built on the edges of the gorge. It was a small town but with a real economy, with its own rhythm of work and social life built around the machines and the constant sound of the water. Flooding ended all of that. The gorge that made the creek's power possible also made it unpredictable and destructive when the rains were heavy. The floods of the late 19th century damaged the mills repeatedly, destroyed buildings, tore out roads and bridges, and left families without the means to rebuild each time the water receded. The economic hardships of the era made the recovery process even more difficult. By the early 20th century, Banning Mills was largely abandoned. Today, the stone ruins of the mills and other buildings are still hidden deep in the gorge. The walls are eroded by time and water. Trees and vines grow through the remains with the patience of everything that is in no hurry. The gorge that killed the town has also preserved it, because its difficult access has kept away those who would have demolished what remains. Number 7. Skull Shoals. Skull Shoals in Greene County has the distinction of having housed the first paper mill in the history of Georgia. That occurred in the early years of the 19th century, when the Oconee River, which ran through the site, provided the energy and water that paper production required. The town grew around that pioneering industry. Workers arrived to operate the machines, families built houses in the surrounding area, and Skull Shoals became known throughout the region for what it produced. The problem was the river itself. The Oconee flooded with a regularity that made it impossible to maintain a stable industrial operation. The mid-19th century floods damaged the mills, destroyed houses, tore out roads and bridges, and forced residents to rebuild again and again with ever scarcer resources. Each time the water receded and the community tried to get back on its feet, the river rose again. By the 1880s, the repetition of those destructions had exhausted the will to stay. The town was abandoned, and nature began the slow and methodical process of reclaiming what had been taken from it. Today, within the Oconee National Forest, you can still see the stone ruins of the paper mill and a boarding house that once lodged the workers. The walls stand among the trees, covered in moss, with the river sounding nearby, as indifferent as ever to the damage it has caused. Number 6. Etowah. Etowah in Bartow County. So it was in 1864, a prosperous town built around mining and the railroad. Gold and mineral deposits in the area had attracted miners and the industries that served miners, and the railroad that passed through the town connected Etowah to broader markets. It was the kind of combination that in the 19th century almost guaranteed growth, natural resources, transportation infrastructure, and a population willing to work. The families living in Etowah had built their businesses and their homes with the confidence that the town would last. But between the 1940s and 1950s, the Army Corps of Engineers began construction of a dam on the Etowah River to create Lake Allatoona. It was the same process that had submerged Burton decades earlier, and that over time would submerge more than one Georgian town beneath the water of a lake created for the benefit of those living somewhere else. By the mid-1950s, the water had completely covered Etowah. Houses, businesses, roads. Everything went beneath the surface. Residents were displaced and had to rebuild their lives elsewhere. Today, Lake Allatoona is a popular recreation destination. Occasionally, when water levels drop more than usual, the foundations of buildings and old roads of Etowah reappear briefly before the lake covers them again, as if the town were trying from time to time to remind the world that it was there. Number 5. Auraria. In 1828, gold was discovered in the hills near Auraria in Lumpkin County. The news spread across the state and across the country with the speed that only the rumor of easy wealth possesses. Almost overnight, thousands of people arrived with their picks and their pans and their hopes, raising tents and cabins where days before there had been nothing. Auraria thus became one of the first great gold rush towns in America, years before California existed in the collective imagination as a promised land. The streets filled with miners who worked by day and spent their earnings by night in the saloons and small businesses that had sprung up to serve them. It was the kind of frantic and disorderly energy that all booms produce, a mix of ambition, occasional violence, improvised camaraderie, and the shared certainty that any day could be the day when everything would change. But gold is not infinite, and the gold at Auraria ran out with the same speed with which it had appeared. And then, in 1848, came the news from California. The gold discovered at Sutter's Mill was incomparably more abundant. Most of the Auraria miners packed their things and headed west without looking back. The population collapsed in weeks. The buildings that had been erected with such urgency were left empty with the same urgency. Today, some of the old wooden buildings of Auraria can still be seen, standing as silent witnesses to an era of fever and ambition that ended as abruptly as it began. Auraria tells the story of how fortune can appear and disappear before you have finished believing in it. Number 4. Jacksonboro. Jacksonboro in Screven County was in the final years of the 18th century, a colonial settlement of some importance. It had a courthouse, houses, businesses, and the political and commercial weight appropriate to a local government center in the Georgia of that era. It was, in every practical sense, a place that had reasons to believe it would last. But Jacksonboro also has a darker story, or at least one harder to verify, that has been passed down from generation to generation as both warning and mystery. According to local accounts, in the early 19th century, an evangelist who had been badly treated by some of the town's residents cursed it before leaving. Whether the story is truth or legend is impossible to know today. What is documented is that shortly afterward, the town began to decline. Businesses closed. Political influence shifted elsewhere. Families left seeking better opportunities. By the mid-19th century, Jacksonboro had lost most of its population. And by the end of that century, almost everything still standing had fallen into abandonment. Today, and the only building that survives from the town's original era is the Seabourn Goodall House. It still stands, silent and a little alone in a landscape that no longer remembers what the town surrounding it once was. Whether the curse was real or not, the result was the same: Jacksonboro disappeared, and that building is all that remains to tell the world that life was here. Number 3. Petersburg. Petersburg in Elbert County was in the early years of the 19th century one of the most important inland commercial centers in Georgia. Its location along the Savannah River made it a natural convergence point for regional trade, and the commodity it moved most was tobacco. Farmers from across the region brought their harvests to Petersburg, where the warehouses and markets along the riverbank processed and shipped the product to other states. At its peak, Petersburg had stores, houses, taverns, and the energy of a place that knows itself to be necessary. The river was its competitive advantage, the reason it existed and the reason it prospered. But competitive advantages are not eternal, and Petersburg's depended on tobacco remaining the dominant crop, and on the river remaining the best way to move it. Neither of those things lasted. Cotton replaced tobacco as the main crop of the South, and the cotton trade organized itself around other towns better connected by the new roads and railroads. Petersburg lost relevance with the slowness of one who does not yet know they are losing. By the end of the 19th century, much of the city was in ruins and abandoned. In the 1940s, and the construction of a dam on the Savannah River created Lake Thurmond. What remained of Petersburg went underwater. Today, on calm days, the lake covers streets and warehouses and houses that were once full of activity. Petersburg is one of the most complete examples in Georgia of how a place can go from indispensable to invisible within the span of a few generations. Number 2. Sunbury in Liberty County was in the 18th century one of the most important ports in Georgia. Its coastal position made it a center of maritime trade where ships arrived from across the Atlantic loaded with goods and departed with rice, indigo, and other products from the region's plantations. For a time, Sunbury competed directly with Savannah for dominance of the port trade in Georgia. And in that it was not an unequal competition. Sunbury's docks were active, its warehouses were full, and the merchant families living there had every reason in the world to believe their port had a future. The American Revolution ended that illusion of permanence. In 1778, British forces attacked Sunbury, destroyed much of the town, and disrupted the commerce that was the foundation of its economy. Families fled. The port was paralyzed. And though the town tried to recover in the years after the war, the damage had been too deep and Savannah's competition too fierce. When General Sherman's troops arrived during the March to the Sea in 1864, they finished what the War of Independence had started. What remained of Sunbury was burned. The buildings still standing fell. The streets that had once been busy were left deserted. Today, Sunbury exists only as archaeological traces. Visitors who come to the site can see scattered foundations and artifacts that archaeologists have recovered, but the docks and warehouses and merchants' houses have disappeared. Sunbury is the most eloquent reminder on this list that war does not distinguish between soldiers and towns. It burns everything with the same indifference. Number 1 was founded by those who fled persecution, and it ended the way it began, in silence. Number 1. New Ebenezer. New Ebenezer in Effingham County was founded in 1736 by immigrants from Salzburg, Austria. They had come to Georgia fleeing religious persecution in Europe, looking for a place where they could practice their faith without fear. The Georgia colony, relatively new at that time, offered that possibility. And the Salzburgers took it with the seriousness of people who know what freedom of conscience costs. The town grew with the order and determination that characterized these religious immigrant communities. Families built houses, cleared fields, planted crops, and raised their children with the same faith that had brought them here. Agriculture was the heart of the economy, but the church and the school were the heart of the community. New Ebenezer was a place where life had defined purpose, and where each generation knew what it owed to the next. The American Revolution disturbed that order. Trade routes were disrupted. The regional economy suffered. And New Ebenezer, like so many other small settlements, did not have the resources to absorb those difficulties without consequences. Some families left. The population began to fall. And as the decades passed, with no dramatic event accelerating the process, New Ebenezer simply emptied with the slowness of everything that no longer has enough people to sustain itself. By the early 19th century, the town had largely disappeared. The houses had collapsed, the farms were overgrown. What the Salzburgers had built with such effort had returned to the earth in the same silent way that almost everything ends. What remains today is the Jerusalem Lutheran Church and its cemetery. The church still stands, solid, maintained, as if those who built it had known that whatever remained of their town would have to be the building that represented their reason for having come all this way. The cemetery holds those who founded the town and those who sustained it for as long as it lasted. The headstones are there with their names in German and their 18th century dates, in a Georgia that no longer remembers almost anyone buried there. New Ebenezer began as an act of faith. It ended as an act of silence. And the church that remains is, in its way, both things at once. Closing. 13 towns, 13 ways of disappearing in Georgia. Beneath the water of the lakes they built to give electricity to the cities. Burned by the armies of a war that was not about them, but that consumed them all the same. Abandoned when the train chose another route, when the gold ran out, when the young found reasons not to come back. Erased by the violence of those who decided that certain people had no right to stay. Georgia is a state of long memory and dense silence. Its forests hold things that its inhabitants prefer not to look at directly. And its lakes cover stories that recreation and tourism help keep from being remembered too well. But the stories are there, in the foundations that divers find at the bottom of the lakes, in the small cemeteries beneath the tall trees, in the stone ruins that the forest has not yet finished swallowing, in the names inscribed on historical markers that nobody stops to read at the edge of roads that no longer lead anywhere. Georgia has more buried past than its postcards are willing to show. And that past, like everything buried without resolution, keeps seeping upward.